Hello and welcome back to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos weekly as a companion to go along with a study of the Bible that we are going through here in my congregation based on something called the story, which kind of sort of looks like that. The story is a condensed Bible narrative intended to kind of help introduce people to the overarching narrative of the, for lack of a better term, the story that is kind of going through of God's work within creation and with humanity throughout the course of the Bible. Put together a few years back by a guy named Randy Frazee. This particular week, we looked at chapter 19, which is entitled The Return Home. And this looks at the period of time when the Israelite people, or the Jewish people as they came to be called, were allowed to return back to the Promised Land following a period of exile to the Babylonian Empire. Now this happens at kind of an interesting period of history. We've moved into a time when historical records kind of give us a little more of a glimmer into what was going on at the time within the area. And as we go back a few chapters, just kind of this block of time that we're in, we had the division of the kingdom of Israel into the northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. That happened right about the year 900 BC, give or take a little bit. And then the Assyrian exile, when the northern kingdom of Israel was taken over by the Assyrian Empire, and many of the prominent people from that kingdom were hauled off into exile. They never really returned either. They remained kind of dispersed out through the known world at that time, and many other people from the Assyrian Empire came in and settled in that northern kingdom, which would become Samaria. Following that, the Assyrian Empire fell to the Babylonians, and the Babylonians a little while later came in and were able to take over and wipe out the southern kingdom of Judah, including Jerusalem. Destroyed the temple, again hauled many people off into exile, a lot of the prominent people. That includes Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which we talked about in the last video, if you happen to catch that one. It's what we talked about in our last meeting a couple of weeks back. And so that was all going on, and that exile lasted for about 70 years was the amount of time that was going on. And we kind of come in this week in chapter 19 right about the year 538 BCE, so a little over 500 years before Jesus comes on the scene. That's kind of where we're at in this time. Now, so the Babylonians had come in and taken over, and they had been the power in the area at least for that 70-year period. And then we pick up pretty much immediately after the Persian Empire has come in and wiped out the Babylonians. So we start off with King Cyrus. Now, we've heard about Cyrus before. Again, when we were talking about Daniel, Cyrus pops up. And there's some different names that are prominent in terms of the leadership of the empires at the time, specifically the Persian Empire, that come into play throughout the course of this historical block. Cyrus is the first one. He actually issues a decree right away that the Jewish exiles can return home. Now, this was thought to be pretty common for him. They were essentially enemies of his enemy, the Babylonians. So by all means, the people who you're looking to control, try and make them as happy as possible. So let them go home. Let them rebuild their temple and the center of their worship. Now, this is something else that we have some historical records that Cyrus did for some other different kingdoms or cultures as well, allowed them to rebuild their main temple so that they can worship as they see fit, and can will be happy, will be content, and will not try and rise up against those who are in power. So that was kind of Cyrus's thing. And so right away after taking over, he says to the people, you can return and rebuild your temple, and we'll even help you pay for it. We'll help fund the rebuilding of the temple. So that happens right away. So Cyrus is one. Then we hear of King Darius, who it's believed to have been the successor of Cyrus. Now, here's an interesting thing, and we talked about this a little bit last time. Cyrus is also known as Darius, but the records that I have, at least that I was able to get a hold of, show that Cyrus / Darius is a different person than the Darius that we're talking about in this chapter, who kind of oversees and helps with some of the stuff that's going on. Now, the other name that kind of comes up more in passing within the story, but it's prominent a little bit more within the full scripture, is Artaxerxes, who I believe to be the successor of Darius. So maybe like the third person, but don't quote me on that. It could be a little bit farther down the line. And then there's also Xerxes, who is the king at the time of in the book of Esther, which we'll look at next week. But so we've kind of got this big block, and the reason for that and these different leaders is this chapter covers a pretty healthy amount of time. Again, starts in about the year 538 when Cyrus allows the people to go back, and we go all the way until the completion of the temple. And kind of the restoration of the city of Jerusalem. It's about 80 years later, 455. So we're getting even closer to the time of Jesus, but we're still several centuries away from that. So because of this large block of time, there's quite a bit of leadership change within the empires. Now, also within this chapter, we hear about some of the other leaders of the neighboring nations, who are, of course, all vassals to Persia at this point, but have been to Babylon, and they don't really like the fact that Jerusalem is being rebuilt, that Judah is kind of getting reestablished. They're concerned that maybe that will increase, and they'll have a return to the time when Israel was in great power. Excuse me, I have to wipe my nose. Gotta love winter. The time when, before, like in the reign of David and Solomon, when Israel was quite powerful, they were concerned about that, and perhaps that if they get powerful again, they'll defy Persia, and then Persia will come in and wipe them all out again. So some of the neighboring countries or neighboring nations and cultures are concerned about that. We see that. So that's kind of what's going on in the background in terms of time frame, in terms of powers that be within the power or within the region when this chapter happens. So again, this one is called The Return Home. It is taken mainly from the narrative that's found in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Within the Jewish writings, those are a single book, a single writing. We have them divided within the Christian Bible, but that's kind of where they come from. And then also we have some small prophetic writings from Haggai and Zechariah, which were contemporary prophets that were kind of active about the same time within the reestablishment of Jerusalem. Now, those are both some of the minor prophets. Haggai is quite short. It's only 2 chapters long. Zechariah is a little bit longer. It's actually the longest of the minor prophets, but it's still not super long. So that's kind of where our narrative comes from as we hear about it. Now, some of the things that go on, of course, the first section that we talked about is the return and the reestablishment of the temple, or the first attempt to rebuild the temple. When the people returned, the very first thing that they worked on was rebuilding the temple. And we talked in our discussion last night about why would that be? Why would that be the central point? Why is that so important? And actually, the very first thing that they build is the altar. And we discussed the notion that the altar and the temple are central to their culture. And we've talked about this in some past videos, but for the Jewish people, they have the distinction of having a God that dwells among them. If we look back through history, we've seen that God dwells on the holy mountain, and then God dwells among the people as they wander in the desert, in the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and then once Solomon builds the temple, God dwells in the temple. So for them, the temple is very central, and the altar is the central point of that. That's where they make their sacrifices to God. That's where they come before God. During our discussion, we talked a little bit about if we were in this situation, what would we build first? What would be that central portion for us? And some different ideas were presented within our discussion, but we kind of came to the consensus that for us, the table is kind of the central point. That's where we gather around the table in the early church, like first century church. They gathered around a meal. That was kind of their time of worship. That's how they fellowshipped. So, hey, potlucks all the way. We like them, but so that was kind of the notion that we had as well. That we gather around word, we gather around sacrament, and so that's kind of the way that we would look at it if we were in that situation. But so the altar is the first thing that is rebuilt, and then once that's rebuilt, then they lay the foundation. And this takes some time because, of course, it's going to be a large building, and they need to rebuild it. But once the foundations are laid, there's a great celebration, and the response of the different people is interesting. The younger people are shouting with joy because, oh, look, we have the foundations of our temple again. Whereas the older, those who it specifies had seen the previous temple, they wept. And we talked about that. Are these tears of joy that, oh, look, we have a temple again? Or are they tears of, oh, this is great that we have the temple, but it pales in comparison to the wonderful, the amazing temple that Solomon created for us, and they've seen that. And of course, we don't know. We weren't there, but there was some discussion of that. So the people are rejoicing, but there's a wide range of emotion, a wide range of emotional response on the part of the people when they begin to reestablish this. But again, it's at this point, and I mentioned it earlier, that some of the neighbors start to get restless. They kind of don't like what's going on. And we see that there is a correspondence that goes on, and it's very political in nature. It's very much appealing to the powers that be, and some of the neighboring governors, and we believe that they are probably the people who are in charge of like Samaria, so the area directly north of Jerusalem, that they write a letter to the king of Persia. Now, within the scripture or within the Bible, we kind of things get twisted out of order. First, we hear that they sent it to Artaxerxes. Well, he was later in history, but then a little bit later on in the narrative, we also hear that they've written to Darius. They're like, hey, under whose authority are these guys doing it? Are you aware that they're doing this? And Darius writes back and says, well, yes, we've looked through the chronicles, we've looked through the history, and Cyrus told them to rebuild this. So in our history, yes, they're supposed to rebuild it. And so, well, the local neighbors are ticked off and are trying to use the political system to strike down the Jewish people and the rebuilding of the temple. God has other plans, and God's like, no, we're all over this, and they actually end up having to fund it themselves, or else they'll be hauled out, and beams will be taken out of their homes, and they will be impaled upon them, which is kind of harsh. But in this first time, we do hear that there's a pause. So this opposition really slows down the work and eventually stops it. Again, that started in about the year 538, and lasts for about 16 years. And during this initial work, and then the break before it starts again, and then they begin to rebuild it again. Now, eventually, the temple is completed, and that happens in about the year 515. So we're looking at about 23 odd years after they've returned. And then as things continue, and we kind of shift our focus into some of the more prophetic writings that are included in this chapter, we see that the people return to, they reestablish the Mosaic law, Moses' law, Torah law, they call it. And that happens in about the year 460. And then under another prophet, Nehemiah, eventually we have the completion of the city, the rebuilding of the city walls, and Jerusalem is kind of completed again. But that doesn't happen until about the year 455, and we'll actually look at that in a couple of weeks as the Old Testament wraps up. But we see, I need to back up just a little bit. In the pause, in the break of working on the temple, the people begin to focus on their own homes. And part of when the prophet Haggai starts talking and sharing the word of the Lord, it's encouragement. It's a little bit of a rebuke, like, what are you doing? But go back to work on the temple, and encouraging them to go back to work on the temple. Like, I have ordained this to happen. I, the Lord, am with you. Do not be afraid. Go do it. And again, we kind of, in our discussion, we talked about that return to that centralized focus, that central goal for the people. Give them something to focus on together, rather than just looking out for themselves and looking out for their own homes. These are people who are used to being displaced, who are people who have a history of living in tents and working together to build something. So God gives them that goal. That's a lot of what was going on within the chapter. Quite a bit of our discussion centered around that. We spent a lot of time kind of talking about the history, similar to how I began the video today. So that was a lot of what we discussed within our conversation, and kind of what's going on within the historical block of that. If you have questions, comments, by all means, please share those down below, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. Next time, we'll share the story of Queen Esther, how her bravery helps save the lives of many Jewish people all around the empire at the time. So otherwise, have a great week. We'll catch you next time. God bless.